This was a paper given at the 15th Century Conference a few years ago, but I don't think many, other than the Gascon Roll Project team, were present. It was some initial findings on the end of Lancastrian Gascony, and I'm going to share these thoughts with you today. We're very sorry that Guillaume de Sarrat de Tremange hasn't been able to come. We had an email yesterday from him saying that his wife was unwell, but he still hoped to be able to come and that he might be late. But unless he's lurking in the room, unless I know what he looks like, so I can see he's not here, we apologise that he's not been able to be with us. What is interesting about the Gascon Rolls, as I think was said this morning, is in fact they start quite early in the day, but they end after the loss of Gascony in 1453. In fact, they go on. The last entry on a Gascon roll is the 21st of October, 1467. So that's over 16 years since the first fall of Bordeaux on the 30th of June 1451, and 14 years since the final fall of the city on the 19th of October 1453. So despite the loss of the duchy, a Gascon roll was maintained in the English Chancery after these key dates. You can see the impact of the first loss by the fact that a composite roll was produced for the regnal years September 1450 to the 31st of August 1452, but that is not in itself unusual. Simon and Guillaume will be able to say of other rolls where more than 1 year is dealt with. In fact, there are some for the reign of Henry V. But over the next 4 years, that's from 1452 onwards, the rolls were produced on an annual basis, as they had been for most of the previous 2 centuries. After the 1st of September 1456, however, we have only 2 rolls. 143 is a composite roll which covers 5 years, with 1 or more membranes being devoted to the business of each regnal year. Its last entry is probably the 28th of January 1461. Of course, Edward IV's reign began on the 4th of March of that year. The following roll, 144, is also a composite roll. On the first membrane, first entry is followed by a note, here begins 7 Edward IV, i.e. the 4th of March 1467. I think that's the picture of it there. And there are 3 other membranes with entries difficult to date, but which seem to cover the first 2 regnal years of Edward IV's reign, 1461 to 3, and years 6 and 7, 1466 to 68. In the absence of evidence to the contrary, we can only assume that this was the last Gascon roll produced in the Chancery. And what happened to the membranes, assuming there were any, from 1464 to 66 remains unknown. Now, that the rolls came to an end is not surprising. The Duchy of Aquitaine or Guyenne had been lost and had not been recovered. But what's interesting is that a roll had been continued even after the first surrender, which had marked the effective end of English rule. And, of course, that it was maintained after the final loss of the duchy. Obviously, the length and content of the rolls varies considerably over the period 1450 to 1468, but the fluctuation of business is evident, although there are often blank sequences in the rolls. You can see there the differences. It's quite interesting. There's like the 15 membranes for the period 1456 to 61. Now, I must thank particularly Simon Harris for his work on the content of the roll here, and indeed this was done before we actually put up the rolls for that period, so some of the conclusions may need modification, and also thanks to Guillaume and to Philip for further feedback on some of these ideas. But an initial explanation then for the continuation of the roll after the losses of the summer of 1451 is that in both England and Gascony there were early hopes of recovery. Richard Woodville, Lord Rivers, had been appointed seneschal for 5 years on the 18th of October 1451, and 45 protections for men to cross in his company were enrolled on the Gascon rolls between November 1451 and April 1452. However, no expedition was in fact launched. Indeed, this was just one of a series of appointments running through the 1440s that never seemed to have come to fruition, either because the appointees simply didn't want to go to the duchy, and this whole aspect of personal choice in warfare, I think, is perhaps one we've overlooked, or because the English government was too cash-strapped to pay for the sending of the appointee and his retinue. Remember also ideas of trying to defend Normandy between 1449 and 1450. But the roll for 1450 to 52 includes licences for victuals to be sent to the duchy. This was always a big military problem, as we see earlier. In fact, we see it in the reign of Henry V also. And as we shall see, there were other ways in which the loyal population of the duchy were kept warm, even after the fall of Bordeaux in 1451. So the first troops to reach the duchy came under John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, in October 1452. His appointment as Lieutenant General for 6 years was enrolled in the Gascon rolls on the 2nd of September 1452, the same date as its enrolment on the patent rolls. No protections for this force are found on the rolls, presumably because the expedition was initially portrayed as for the keeping of the sea. But we do find protections for those intending to serve in reinforcements recruited in the spring of 1453, although most appear to be for victuallers and administrators rather than soldiers. Bordeaux was recovered on the 23rd of October. Other sources show that some Bordelais opened the gates and pursued French soldiers out into the streets of Bordeaux, indicating that Talbot's success was partly based on strong local support. However, there was relatively little further reacquisition of territory by Talbot, and as Vale points out, this period of English control of Bordeaux and its hinterland was in effect a military occupation. So we have a contrast with English Gascony up to that point, maybe the only time in its history that it actually was occupied, even if it's only a relatively small area around Bordeaux itself. Nonetheless, Talbot's successes vindicated hopes of recovery, which had been fostered in England, and I think which had supported the continuation of the Gascon rolls. Talbot was defeated and killed at the Battle of Castillon on the 17th of July 1453, and as the rolls put it, by the unfavourable fortune of war. That's a little bit of an understatement, really. Bordeaux then surrendered for a second time on the 19th of October after a 3-month siege. The duchy was in enemy hands, and the rolls described this as against God and against justice. That juxtaposition is a very important one. It was much used in the reign of Henry V. For instance, when Henry Sting was to be arrested because of a charge of rape by him and his retinue against someone in Normandy. This is quite early in the second campaign. The act was deemed to be against God and the King's justice. This sort of idea of offences, if you like, as being against the Almighty and against the Crown, or against the Crown's rights and justice, is, I think, quite an important way in which these things were portrayed. Much as Trevor has said, the actual language used is worth attention in this. The first entry on the Gascon roll for the regnal year 1453-4, composed in the aftermath of Talbot's defeat, is the appointment on the 12th of September 1453, and remember this is before the actual surrender of Bordeaux, although the rolls are often made up later anyway, of Sir William Bonville as Lieutenant of the Duchy. So he's still optimistic that things will still be okay, even though Talbot has been killed. Indentures were drawn up for the relieving army on the 25th of July, presumably in knowledge of the battle that had been fought on the 17th of July, to muster on the 20th of August. That was a very, very quick turnaround. Mainly in the 15th century, it took 3 months for an army to be raised in England from indenture to embarkation. So they were really pushing it to get it recruited and sent to Gascony in as short a time as under a month. There were a couple of protections enrolled on the 12th of September. at the same time as Bonneville was appointed lieutenant, but these were more likely for victuallers again than soldiers. And indeed, one thing we're noticing in the Gascon rolls is just how many of the protections were for victuallers or butchers and others of this sort. Now, the challenge for the soldier team was working out whether these were soldiers as well, and I think some of them were. Rather like you get archers who are fletchers and bowyers, it seems inevitable that some people in the army were already in the catering corps, so to speak. Even with news of Castillon, therefore, the English proposed some response, and hence a reason to continue enrolments. After all, Bonneville was not given a fixed-term appointment, and this is interesting as well, but was to be in office during royal pleasure. And this is an expression either of optimism or of imagination, depending on how one looks at these things. In reality, the fall of Bordeaux had ended any hopes of military recovery. And this takes us back again to the importance of the Gascons themselves in the affairs of 1451-3. As Vail has pointed out, the French had already made considerable inroads into the hearts and minds of the Gascons by 1451, and only a small group of exiles and malcontents were involved in Talbot's recovery of Bordeaux in October 1452. But the Gascon lobby in England between 1450 and 52 was notable. The highly influential, in that he became a member of the English Royal Council, Père du Tast, Dean of Saint-Cyrin in Bordeaux, was in England from January 1450 to his death in 1467. And as an aside, is the date of his death significant in the context of the decision to end the keeping of the Gascon roll after his death? Maybe. Or is it to do with English foreign policy? In 1467-8, Edward IV was entering into alliances with the Dukes of Brittany and Burgundy for a three-pronged invasion of France. Many, if not the majority of entries on the rolls between the first and second losses of Bordeaux, this is 1451-3 then, concern Gascons. There is some evidence of Gascons who sought domicile in England, although not as many as we might have expected, and only a tiny proportion of the 2,000 whom Pégrin considered came to England as exiles. This was an article written in the Annales du Midi in 1954 on Gascon emigrants in England, 1453 to 1485, and he kind of portrayed it as sort of like Calais nowadays, really, that the Gascons couldn't wait to get to England, suggested there were 20,000 came to England. I think that's highly unlikely, and certainly if we were to rely on the rolls alone, we wouldn't get anywhere near that figure. But there are nonetheless petitions there in evidence, and that these men were granted permission to make arrangements for their movable goods in the duchy to be brought to England, because that needed not only kind of authority to take things from the duchy and also protection, hopefully against French attack as well. At that point, it sort of relied on the French doing the decent thing, but also permission for them to come to England and bring their goods to England. More notable is the incentivisation provided by the English government for those who'd remained loyal to return to the duchy. So, in a way, this was the resettlement of immigrants by the English government in the 15th century. And it seems to be a conscious policy begun in April 1452. A proclamation was issued for all those Gascons in England to appear before the Royal Council on the 6th of May to hear matters for the good and utility of us and this kingdom. And in the months which followed, right up to July 1453 in the Battle of Castillon, there was a large number of grants of offices and lands in the duchy to Gascons. Although, to be honest, these were made to a relatively small group, mainly from the lower social status families in the duchy. Grants of offices and lands in Gascony were also made to Englishmen who'd previously served in the duchy. Indeed, there seem to be more grants and estates and offices to Englishmen than in the 14th century. There's some irony here that when we don't control it anymore, we give out more of it in patronage. This may represent the insertion of loyal and trusted English to bolster the flagging position, thereby creating a greater feeling, maybe of a colonial outlook, on the part of the English government. Although some grants were to Englishmen who'd had long experience in the duchy, such as George Swillington. We found 33 grants between early June and 31st of August 1452, and a further 19 in the roll for 1452-3. And some were of lands of Gascons who had chosen French allegiance and who are now described as enemies and rebels. So you see the figures of grants to lands and offices, the penultimate column at the bottom there. You can see then the very large number in 1451-2. Of course, all such grants were speculative, since they were properties, and until late October 1452, offices which were not in the control of the Anglo-Gascon administration anymore. The grants were made then to incentivise recipients to support a re-establishment of English rule, and therefore accompany the surprise military action of Talbot in October 1452. As in the late 1360s, there was an effort to encourage recipients to recover the lost lands. It's also reminiscent of the late 1330s and 40s, when the English position was at a low ebb, and indeed of policies in Lancastrian Normandy, where a number of grants, such as Bedford's grant of Maine and Anjou, was in anticipation of his conquest of it, i.e. you're given it and then you're told to go and get it. Some grants of 1452 were of potential military significance in the recovery as well. For instance, captaincies of key locations were also given out in advance. Others were aimed at re-establishing the administration in Bordeaux. And after Talbot's recovery of Bordeaux, we find pardons to those who had accepted French allegiance in 1451. This reminds us of a fundamental point. The Gascon rolls were compiled in England. They were not part of or record of the administration located within the duchy, and therefore it was possible for them to exist, even if the duchy was no longer wholly or even partly in English hands. We could still have them today, were we to wish it. In fact, my husband suggested, rather ironically, the other night that maybe in this Agincourt year we should propose that Parliament suggests the recovery of the Calais March as the solution to the immigrants. As we've noted, most entries between 1451 and 1453 concern the planned recovery of the duchy. There's very little normal business, such as the customary lordly activity and judicial business, characteristic of the rolls to 1450, though we must also point out that the Gascon rolls show a general fading of business from 1448 onwards. The final loss of the duchy in the summer and early autumn of 1453 is not surprisingly a turning point for the rolls as much as it was for English hopes of recovery. So, for instance, only 2 protections are found after then, one for service at Calais, which was placed on the Gascon roll in error in May 1455, and another one for service in Ham, another garrison in the Calais Pale, similarly placed there in May 1458. I just love it when they put these things on the wrong rolls. I mean, you know, it's slightly crazy there, but perhaps we've all sort of put our date of birth when we meant today's date and things of this sort when we fill forms in. So it just shows they were human, these administrators. After the loss of the duchy, the compensatory arrangements for exiled Gascons continued, whether by safe contacts to come to England or facilitations to recover movable property or other concessions. But the emphasis of the rolls after 1453 changes to English merchants who wished to gain licences to trade with French-held Bordeaux, Bayonne and Aquitaine more generally, as well as occasionally Spain and Brittany. There's a smattering of these in earlier rolls, by the way, and indeed in the early 1450s, licences had been given for the sake of ensuring victuals to the beleaguered and subsequently recovered areas. The majority of entries then in the rolls from 1454 onwards to 1467 are trading licences. Some are linked to earlier experiences, such as the intention of using trade income to pay a ransom. And this was something Remy Amble discovered in his work on prisoners. It was quite common for the Crown to give concessions of this sort in order to raise money to pay a ransom. Rather than the government giving you the money straight up, you got it indirectly. The majority, though, were simply for named merchants, mainly of London and Bristol, although with some from other areas, not least Saint-Jean-de-Luz, which is the rather nice holiday resort near to Bayonne, worth a visit. The licences were limited to a named ship, so it shows this sort of control factor. It was a named ship whose tonnage was also defined to avoid fraudulent activity. The name of the master and the owner were also usually given, and these are important for Craig Lambert's database of ships. In this regard, the licences are a very important source. Another form of document in the later rolls is the safe conduct, particularly for Gascons, and especially merchants of Bordeaux and Bayonne, to come to England with their goods to trade. More intriguingly is that grants of offices in the Laulos Duchy continued to be issued right to the end of rolls in 1467. So what does this mean about lingering hopes of recovery of Gascony? And there's a final intriguing point to be made about these late Gascon rolls. Most entries are of acts made in Westminster, as they are across the whole period. But in August 1451, 3 entries are dated in Canterbury and Wye, where Henry VI was at that point, according to the itinerary in Wolfe's biography. In the rolls covering the summer of 1454, during the protectorate of Richard, Duke of York, there is a period between the 18th of July and the 3rd of October when an itinerary to Yorkshire is apparent. But by whom? Bertram Wolfe's biography, with its very useful itinerary of Henry VI, has Henry VI resident at Windsor for the whole of 1454. Remember, he's mad at this point. The Duke of York is considered to have attended the legal cases in the Percy Neville dispute at York in the second half of June 1454, but then returned to London. So how is this itinerary explained? Perhaps it is, or even presumably it is, the itinerary of Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, who'd been appointed Chancellor of England by the Duke of York on the 28th of March 1454. In his work on Gascon exiles in England, which drew on a wide range of sources, not simply the Gascon rolls, as I've said, Pégrin detected an interesting pattern. The dispossessed Gascons were well treated by the Duke of York during his protectorates of April to November 1454 and May 1455 to October 1456. But very few grants to help the Gascons were made to them during the periods of Henry VI's recovery in between and subsequently. So, as we all suspected, the Duke of York had a Labour immigration policy as opposed to a Lancastrian Tory immigration policy. So maybe the Gascon rolls are more interesting than we might think for the historian of the Wars of the Roses. Thanks very much.